I suppose I should begin by apologizing for confining my remarks to a single country. North America is too large. But when the United States sneezes, the rest of the world gets a cold. And so any consideration of whether religion is going to be part of the problem or part of the solution, I'm afraid needs to take note of the role of religion in American politics generally and foreign policy in particular. As has been true in many places around the globe, that role has expanded to a remarkable extent over the past several decades. To be sure, religion has always been a factor in American electoral politics. We're coming up to an election, so I can't help thinking about it today. With partisan voting blocs often constituted by religious or ethno-religious identity, the Catholic vote, Democratic, the Jewish vote, Democratic, the Mormon vote, Republican, the white Protestant vote, Republican, outside the South, until recently, and so on. It may fairly be said that the rise of the religious right in the 1970s was the result of a concerted effort by conservative pastors and Republican Party operatives to move white Southerners from their traditional allegiance to the Democratic Party, traditional since the Civil War, into the Republican fold, an effort made possible by the National Democratic embrace of civil rights after World War II. The effort, of course, succeeded so well that Southern evangelical Protestants now constitute the base of the Republican Party. But what is new in American politics over the past couple of decades is the creation of a partisan divide according to degree of religious commitment, regardless of religious affiliation. That is to say, the more religious you are, the more likely you are to vote Republican. The less religious, the more likely to vote Democratic. This divide has come to be called the God gap, though it could just as well be called the godless gap. On the one side, 60% of those Americans who say they attend worship services at least once a week vote Republican. On the other, 3/4 of those who say they have no religion vote Democratic. The latter group, by the way, has more than doubled in size over the past 2 decades, such that it now represents over 15% of the American adult population. Perhaps not very large by European standards, but we consider that quite a change. Along with African Americans, who are religiously a special case, by the way, these constitute the base of the Democratic Party. The God and godless gaps have given current American politics something of the feel of European politics in the 19th and early 20th centuries, with a secular left opposing a religious right across a broad cultural divide. In struggles ranging from abortion rights and gay rights to evolution, that is Darwinian evolution, and climate change, we also consider ourselves engaged in a culture war. And while the battle lines shift back and forth on particular issues, currently abortion rights seem to be losing a bit of ground, same-sex marriage winning, the fundamental divide is, I would say, growing stronger rather than weaker. Today, for example, that is the 21st of June, marks the beginning of something called the Fortnight for Freedom, a 2-week propaganda exercise announced by the American Catholic bishops because, in their view, religious liberty is under attack in America by the government. Their principal concerns, that is the bishops, is to protest a requirement under our new health care law, which may be our unconstitutional health care law shortly, but be that as it may. The bishops wanted to get their oar in the water before anything like that happened. Their belief that the new health care law requiring insurers to provide coverage for contraceptive services to women free of charge, that's an imposition on their religious freedom and to be fought tooth and nail. And that's the front line of the American culture war at the very moment we exist now. Now, there's a case to be made that religiously informed domestic politics have provided a useful mechanism, and do provide a useful mechanism, for socially conservative citizens to push back against changes in norms and mores that they oppose. And whatever one feels about such new norms and mores, a healthy society should provide citizens with means of expressing themselves through collective action. In the international arena, however, I'm not so sure the effects have that much going for them. Since the attacks of September 11th, 2001, the simplicity of a domestic war of religion against secularism, or vice versa, has been complicated by the conviction among conservative evangelicals in particular that America is also embroiled in an old-fashioned war of religion, one of Christians, or perhaps Judeo-Christians, against Muslims, or perhaps Islamists. Thanks to the determined efforts of the Bush administration, 9/11 and the consequent invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq were cast as a war against terror rather than Islam, although there's evidence that President Bush himself saw the contest in literally apocalyptic terms, Christian apocalyptic, that is. Anti-Islamism, however, has gained political legitimacy since the beginning of the Obama administration, most notably during the 2010 midterm elections, when Republican candidates were able to make successful wedge issues out of mosque building in various communities, including New York City, and an alleged threat of, quote unquote, Sharia law to American jurisprudence. Creating a consistent religious ideology out of twin wars against secularists and Islamists has not been easy. But during the present presidential cycle, Newt Gingrich gave it the old college try. In January of this year, for example, he said, and I quote, "From my perspective, you don't have an issue of religious tolerance. You have an elite which favors radical Islam over Christianity and Judaism. You have constant pressure by secular judges and religious bigots to drive Christianity out of public life and to establish a secular state except when it comes to radical Islam." I couldn't make this up. If nothing else, this provides a certain window into the worldview of the party that could well control both houses of Congress and the presidency come next January. Now, here in Israel, the importance of the evangelical right in America has been recognized for longer than it's been recognized in America itself. That is, ever since Prime Minister Begin invited the Reverend Jerry Falwell to come to Israel in 1978. 35 years later, we have graduated to Pastor John Hagee's Christians United for Israel. In the US, the culture war has effectively theologized America's support for the Jewish state. Theologizing the Arab-Israeli conflict is, at least in my view, part of the problem, not part of the solution. Of course, the problem, however we decide to define it, is hardly confined to Israel-Palestine, I would say. However, that here too, in the larger world, the culture war has pushed American foreign policy in some problematic directions. And I'll just cite one small case in point, and that is the 1998 International Religious Freedom Act, which began as a plan to embarrass the Clinton administration and which over the years has given the world some reason to think that when it comes to religious liberty away from home, the US is principally interested in making the world safe for Christian missionaries. Again, this does not seem to me to be part of the solution. To be sure, activist religion in America is not all about politics. On the international front, many faith-based NGOs, such as Catholic Relief Services and World Vision, mentioned before, must be placed, at least mostly, on the positive side of the ledger. While recognizing that such aid may come with religious strings attached, there's no doubt that when it comes to acute and chronic needs of populations around the world, solutions would be a lot harder to come by without the religious impulse to heal the world. And that's a widespread impulse. Let me then conclude by noting, perhaps by way of some explanation here, that over the past 2 decades, Americans have increasingly come to see religion as a chosen rather than an ascribed identity. And by that I mean their own religious identity. This is survey data, quite interesting, which shows, seems to show that really when people are asked, what is your religion, if any, they're less inclined to say what they were born as, and more inclined to say simply what their current practice and identification is. This is an interesting development with large consequences for particular religious traditions, but overall, it has had a tendency to polarize the religious landscape, because the people in the middle who cared moderately or little at all, but nonetheless identified with a particular religious community by reason of ascription, seem to drop out of the equation, and you have people moving towards the ends of the spectrum. And this, of course, has tended to heighten the anxiety of religious leaders and institutions who can themselves no longer count so readily on their flocks staying and reproducing in place, as it were. I would propose, perhaps too boldly, that this trend towards religious identity as choice is a worldwide phenomenon, in a way connected to what Guy was talking about at the beginning, a phenomenon that has contributed significantly towards making religion the dynamic force it is today, for good and for ill. If I'm right, it suggests that if religion is not part of the problem, it will be part of the solution, but also that if it is not part of the solution, it will be part of the problem.